Today we're going to be answering a very simple question. Does this headphone deserve to be in the legendary 600 line from Sennheiser? Now, over the years, there have been a ton of different both sold and kind of DIY projects to get an HD600 sound in a closed headphone. Tons of different EQ profiles have come out to do this. Lots of options. Nobody has quite landed on a good version. So I was really curious going into this if Sennheiser themselves could do something great. Now, Sennheiser sent this headphone out, but headphones.com is actually sponsoring today's episode. And if you do want to purchase the HD620, or if you want to reference some of the graphs I'm talking about today, there is going to be a link down below. I'd highly recommend checking them out for not only the 620S, but every headphone we talk about in today's video, as well as other hi-fi equipment like speakers, amps, and DACs. Headphones.com is an awesome resource for that. And I want to thank them for sponsoring today's episode. So the build, I'm a bit confused here. Every 600 series headphone has had more or less exactly the same chassis. A couple different grill changes, some of them had slightly different pads for like the headband, but more or less they're exactly the same. But this is basically just a closed version of the HD560S chassis. The driver does appear to be a bit different. The pads are of course different. The headband material is of course different. And there is a metal kind of plate on the outside of the cup here, but the rest is pretty much plastic. Now in hand, this actually does feel somewhat sturdy actually, even though it does also feel pretty light. And of course you have that locking connector on the left side of the ear cup. One thing I would have liked to see here is them actually bridge the gap between the two builds. If they were dedicated to this style chassis for whatever reason, I would have loved to see them put the HD600 connectors on this headphone instead of the locking connector that they're using. That way, everybody who's already invested in really nice and expensive HD600 cables would be able to just adopt this to the HD620S, which should be in the same line. But they didn't do that. A couple positives to the build. The noise isolation is actually fantastic for a non-noise canceling headphone. This does require a cable input. It is not a wireless headphone. And the noise isolation is of course not as good as the best noise canceling headphones, but it's still pretty good. Also compared to existing HD600 headphones, this does a good job of getting this ear cup kind of off of the surface of your ear. So on HD600 headphones, they kind of touch your ear a little bit. This does a good job of kind of gapping your ear entirely. This is a fairly efficient headphone at 105 dB per milliwatt, but it is actually 150 ohms. So you can actually run this on tube amplifiers, and it does actually show some positive results on there. So those who like to tube roll, you definitely can. That being said, because it's as efficient as it is, I actually had no problem using this just with things like laptops. I thought this is perfectly fine on not that much amplification, which is a plus, especially for a closed back headphone that you will probably take with you. I do wish if they were dedicated to a mobile headphone that they would have gone with a more foldable design, but as of right now, there's no way to fold these cups up. It's kind of just this structure almost all the time. Now these graphs were measured by Doug with a 4128. I'm actually going to be calling back to these graphs a lot because they actually help me explain the sound quite a bit, but also it highlights why graphs are maybe not the most important thing to consider. And I'll talk about why that is in a second. I want to start with the bass response because that's probably the biggest departure from the rest of the 600 line. If you were looking or hoping for more bass from a 600 series headphone, this will provide that in some ways. Now, similar to the 600 line, it's a little bit stronger in the mid bass than it is in the sub bass. The sub bass is not particularly super strong. It's audible, but definitely doesn't have a ton of presence to it and a ton of focus. Now, the mid bass here, as you can see, kind of bumps up around about 120 hertz and kind of provides a little bit of a boxiness to that mid bass. And this isn't super clean sounding, to be honest. I've heard cleaner bass, especially from 600 series headphones, and I actually would have preferred to see a little bit more of a kick in the sub bass instead of the mid bass here. That being said though, the overall bass actually for a closed back headphone hits fairly clean. It is a little bit boxy, but that's when I'm comparing it against its brothers and sisters in the 600 line. Now, most closed back headphones bass is not perfect, this one included. A lot of them have pretty major faults. This one isn't what I would consider a major fault, but it's, again, not perfect. Okay, so the mid-range actually looks pretty complete. So like if you look from right about 200 to 300 hertz, all the way to about 3000 hertz, it actually looks pretty solid, pretty present. And I find this to be consistent with my listening impressions. I find the mid-range here to be relatively complete in most areas. Most vocalists sound pretty full, they sound pretty complete, and tonality, more importantly, seems pretty on point. And I'm liking the mid-range that's coming out of this for a closed-back headphone. Now, considering the things that this is compared against, like the HD600, just the base 600, you start to notice that the mid-range is not really towing the line of this line. It's not quite as like full and weighty, especially in the lower mids. And this might be that dip between 200 and 300 hertz, or it might be the boost in the mid bass region, making the lower mids seem less impressive. Because when you listen to the open back versions, vocals all have a ton of weight, a ton of power, a ton of like dynamic range, and kind of, I don't know, for lack of a better term, like gusto. Like they've got just oomph to the vocals, and they stand out, they pop. They're really just tangible. The 620S, less so. You don't quite get that pop through. You don't quite get that hyper focus that the 600 series, to me, is what they're good at. So while it's pretty decent for a closed back headphone for mid-range, compared to its own line, it's one of the least impressive ones. Now, the overall treble response I would consider to be more on the pleasing edge of stuff. It doesn't have a super zingy or like glary real top end, which is nice. But if you look at the graph, you can kind of see that it oscillates between a dip and a peak. And you can kind of detect this when you're listening to this headphone. And occasionally it comes across a little bit dark bright or even inconsistent between songs, because one song can sound bright and shiny and not that great. And then another song can sound kind of dull and muddy in the top end. And I think it just matters where they land in this top end region above about like 6K. I think that it really depends on where they're playing, how they're playing, and you'll get fairly different experiences on different songs just based off the treble response. It's actually kind of interesting to compare different songs with. That being said, this could have been a lot worse. I don't think it's my favorite, but it could have been a lot worse. Some closed back headphones are really, really, really bright, and some are really, really, really dark. And this is kind of right in the middle. It's somewhat in between, though again, not my favorite performance. One area that I do want to give them credit for though is the region from 6K to 10K. Well, it looks a little bit hot on the graph. They actually managed to get through this area without sibilance. So S's and T's actually come across sounding like S's and T's and not this bright, zingy mess, which I appreciate a lot. Now, when it comes to the overall sound signature of this, something that you won't get from a graph is the general interpretation of the sound, is the general feeling that you get from the sound. They do a good job of maintaining a tonal signature that I would determine as house Sennheiser, which for Sennheiser fans is going to be great. For other people though, I think, for lack of better words, the most apt description of the overall sound is perhaps a tiny bit stale. The rest of the 600 series I find very rich in terms of tonality and texture, and this is just kind of that, but just a little bit reduced and not quite as vivid of a picture through most of its sound. Okay, so imaging and Soundstage. Most headphones these days are pretty good at imaging, this one included. I have no complaints there. The center vocalist focus is awesome, continuing with the rest of the line. The kind of placement of the small instrument sounds is also very nice. When it comes to sound staging though, again, closed back headphone, it's not wonderful. It's not super great. And if I needed soundstage from a closed back headphone, I'd probably stick with something like an Odyssey Maxwell over this. So my long-winded conclusion here. There are some traits of this that are pretty good. I don't think that this is the most impressive headphone at this price range, but what I'm more personally concerned with myself as a massive fan, somebody who's made a multitude of videos of the HD600 line, does this deserve to be in this line? And I quite frankly, I don't think so. Also the price range for this. So this is coming in at $350. Given the chassis that it's built off, given the sound quality that's coming out of here, while it's good, I think it deserves more of like a $200 price range, maybe $250. I think $350 is asking a lot. I would personally just wait for a discount if you're dedicated to buying this headphone. And if it's my $350, I'm personally gonna grab the Odyssey Maxwell instead. It's not exactly the same classification of headphone. That one's wireless. It will not last as long because it has batteries in it, but the sound quality is definitely worth it to me. And it's superior in just about every region that I care about. So I would pick that over this headphone personally. That being said, while it's not my preference, I think that some people will listen to this and love it quite a lot. And the sound signature of it does have its benefits, and one of those benefits is not having massive areas that stand out a lot. So it's not super bright, it's not overly bassy, it's not super mid-range focused. It's kind of a jack of all trades. But yeah, like most headphones, I'd personally recommend trying this one before buying it. It's not for me, but it might be for you, and that's okay. So let me know if what you're seeing on the graphs, what you're seeing from other reviews, sounds good to you or doesn't. What would you rather have for the money? I'd love to have all those questions answered down below. All right, guys, thanks for watching. See you next time.